as we said in the video, it's really been an incredible journey for these 10 years, and we certainly hope to continue. Mainly, we want to thank all of you for coming. We know that these days, and you hear this on airplanes all the time, where the captain thanks you for your business, knowing that there are many other alternative airlines to fly. Well, nothing in comparison to the number of conferences you can go to globally. And the fact that you're here in such large numbers is really very important to us and hopefully important to our future. When normally at these conferences, I speak about current conditions and outlook for global credit markets or financial markets. But given the somewhat historic nature of this particular conference, I thought, and this year is important, to reflect upon 50 years of evolution of the original 1968 published, but indeed, as many of you know, the difference between when you do the research and when you get it published is not exactly a few months. Indeed, it's usually several years. So we began research in the area of distress prediction in 1966, published in my dissertation at UCLA in 1967, and also in the Journal of Finance, 1968. So 50 years, anyway, 50 years is a nice round number, rather than 49, which is kind of pathetic compared to it. So let's say 50 for many reasons. And 50 is very meaningful for me for many ways. First of all, 50 years ago, we built the model. Second, 50 years ago, I got my first job at New York University, Stern School. I can't find another one, so I'm still there after 50 years. And 50 years ago, I was married to my wife, Elaine, who you'll all meet tonight. And actually, it's very helpful for all of these events to be 50 years, because whenever someone asks me, how many years have you been married? I think, well, wait a second. When did I build that first model? Oh, it was 50 years ago. So I never make a mistake the number of years of my marriage. So it's very helpful and to have that coincidence. And 50 years ago was also very important for a different reason. I believe strongly that innovation and creativity and introduction is, I wouldn't say a random process, but it's very much related to when you were born. And when were you in a position to do whatever one does in terms of their productivity. And I'm convinced that when I was a graduate student at UCLA in 1965, 66, I was in the right place at the right time, for two reasons, at least. First, it was the introduction on university campuses of mainframe computers, and the ability in the social sciences, anyway, to enhance the traditional type of research which was available up to then, and provide a fairly rigorous statistical enhancement to the traditional methods, which was only possible with a mainframe computer. We didn't have really almost any other way, at least that I was familiar with, to analyze empirical data. Some of you may remember, particularly if you have gray hair or the lack thereof, the fact that in those days, when you did empirical research, you did it through punch cards. Remember what a punch card was. Some of you do remember. And so you would punch the data on your cards, you'd put it into the box with the source program, you would trek across the campus to the mother computer, you would submit the computer, and then you would go to your favorite church, synagogue, or mosque and pray. Pray that you would get research and output. In my case, it was about a 50% success ratio. And every time you wanted to try a different model, slight variation perhaps in the number of variables or the number of firms, or whether it was holdout sample or original sample, you had to have a new box and submit it. And so that was the state of the art, but at least it was a big enhancement. And second, there was a young assistant professor who named Keith Smith. You probably don't know his name, but for me he was very important because he brought with him a statistical methodology known as discriminant analysis, and one which I could use to perhaps enhance the research in this area at that time. I'm convinced that if I was a student 2 years earlier, I would not have been able to do this because of the lack of computer power, and 2 years later, someone else would have done it. I'm convinced. And so, like Malcolm Gladwell and his book, The Outliers, it's very important not only to have some ideas, but to be in the right place at the right time. And for those of you who are PhD students or already experienced academic researchers, it's not only important to have good ideas, but good ideas that no one else has at least exploited that idea at the time. It's very important to be first, as I'll point out in a number of ways coming forward. The topic has to do with the evolution of the model and subsequent models, and also their applications. And I must say that in 50 years of experiencing this journey, I am always surprised to find a new application. Indeed, on this very trip, we are now celebrating this 50-year anniversary with some stops in Spain and Italy. In Italy, we found in Spain, we found an application that was almost totally new that I never thought much about, and I'll describe it when we get to that section. And so I'm continually interested and surprised with these applications, which, of course, when we built the model, we had, in many cases, no idea. Indeed, scoring systems, whether they be for companies, for individuals, for sovereigns, have been around a long time, a couple of 100 years in the United States, mainly qualitative variables. When it first was used by banks in terms of lending back in the 1800s, as the U.S. expansion went westward, companies needed to be financed. We now call that infrastructure financing, which is a hot topic today. But there was only these fairly crude qualitative variables available. Then around 1909, the introduction of rating agencies and the use of quantitative accounting numbers based on a univariate system was introduced. 1909 for Moody's, 1916 for Standard & Poor's, and these became the traditional way of analyzing financial health of companies. In the 1960s, when we were doing our first research, we said, well, why not introduce, rather than this univariate, one measure at a time technique, the idea of a multivariate, a combined model that introduced accounting variables, but also, for the first time in the literature, a market measure. You all probably know, and I can fast forward here a moment, to the option contingent claims approach, which is basically something known as a structural model, which uses market data primarily on stock prices and volatility and market capitalization relative to debt levels as the main indicator of financial health and bankruptcy potential. Back then, in 1967, when we built our model, we introduced it. We didn't introduce it as comprehensively as Bob Merton did in 1973-74, but it was the first time that a market value measure was combined with accounting measures in order to provide this analysis. And we introduced discriminant analysis into the social sciences, into finance, since then, logit models, probit models, linear, nonlinear models, which are now quite standard, not only in the literature, but just about every financial institution of any decent size in the world has essentially a multivariate, usually logistic model, in order to quantify and to meet Basel II and Basel III requirements with respect to estimated, expected, and unexpected losses. And by the way, I'm really pleased to share this dais, if you will, today with Michael Gordy. He, along with his colleagues at the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, are really the backbone of the introduction of Basel II and Basel III. And if you suffered through reading that 400, 500, 600-page manifesto, blame it on Gordy, because he's the guy who really gave some meat to the bones of the analysis which introduced Basel II, and at the same time made enormous contributions not only to banking, but to research in the banking area that we all have profited from. At any rate, these models have flourished in the consumer area, from manufacturing, non-manufacturing, for emerging markets, et cetera. And I'll go through some of those later on. We've introduced artificial intelligence techniques, neural networks, and the like in order to provide a different methodology to come to, again, the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail eventually became the probability of default and the probability of loss given default, which was not there when we first built the model. You'd think that that was the obvious thing to do, but it was not there when these first generation models were built. Yes, option contingent claims became very appropriate and popular. I sense that these models, I could be wrong, have become less popular in the last, say, half a dozen years for a number of reasons that we can speak about. And I'm mainly referring to the KMV model, which, by the way, was purchased by Moody's in 2001. This was an indication of the difference between model building and data. So the KMV model was monetized, commercialized of the original Merton approach, and was purchased in 2001 for $210 million. 1 month ago, Bureau van Dijk sold their data analysis to Moody's, same purchaser, $3.3 billion. So it's nice to build models, and you may be able to sell it, but it's great to have databases, and really important for others to build models, not only for you to do it. And so it's a lesson that we all can learn. I would say that the current main thrust in failure prediction models is what's called a blended approach, combining financial data on companies, market value information, and macroeconomic data. Perhaps in the future we will have more established models providing what might be called governance and qualitative measures of company performance. And so that blended approach, and indeed we are working on, have been working on one in the UK that does involve things like payment history, boards of director activities, some softer variables to be combined with the quantitative ones. Here again are the major rating agency categories. We're all familiar with them. And I personally profited a lot by my association with rating agencies. And I'm not just saying that for my work currently with Standard & Poor's Global Market Intelligence, which I've really enjoyed and profited from in terms of learning about what's going on in the ratings and in the information content world. But if you go back to 1982, several years after we built our first models, I'm going to fast forward to a graph which is really interesting, if I can find it. This shows the growth of the U.S. high-yield bond market, known as junk bonds. And when we, again, it was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. When a large investment bank came to me and said, by the way, would you like a job? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, we're starting a credit risk department. This was at Morgan Stanley. We're starting a credit risk department there, and we're looking for someone to fill it. Would you be interested? So I started thinking about all the extra zeros in my salary compared to what I was making at New York University. But after a short time, I said, you know, my colleague Malcolm Brenner would say, you know, you don't want to go into the real world, do you? You know, you have to get up early in the morning, got to work all day and maybe weekends. Come on. So I said, no, I'm not really interested, but it's a fascinating idea. She said, well, would you be interested in doing a kind of white paper on the risk and return trade-off in this new market called high-yield bonds? At that time, about $10 billion outstanding, mainly fallen angels, investment grade at birth, non-investment grade as you get older, like people. Most companies, many companies get uglier as they get older, and you know, develop wrinkles, lose your hair, and you get downgraded from investment grade to non-investment grade. This now was a new market for original issue non-investment grade. Didn't exist before, except in this fallen angel world. And Morgan Stanley wanted to know the risk and return trade-off. And the first thing we asked was, is there any data? Without data, how can you, yes, you can build theoretical models, but you can't test it, and you can't measure the risk and return very carefully. Well, there were no databases, so we said, let's start building them. And we have built them and maintained them ever since then. Again, being first is really important, because if there's no other data and you start building it, you have a comparative advantage. I can show you the growth. This is the growth of the European high-yield bond market. Today, it's even higher than this, about 500 plus billion euros, about 1/3 the size of the US market. And more recently, based on some work we are doing now in the Italian mini-bond market, this is for small and medium-sized firms, primarily to issue debt directly to the public in small denominations of 5 to 30 or 40 or 50 million dollars. I'll mention this a little later on as a practical application of our models. Again, no databases, no risk-return trade-off analyses. And so the market is begging for that. Question is, will it survive? And I'm convinced it will not survive without a very rigorous analysis of the risk-return trade-offs, which I think is beginning to happen. So, again, being in the right place at the right time helps. So let's go back to 1966 and ask the question, multivariate as opposed to univariate analysis, where there would be a bottom line, there would be and here's the important point. When you build that first model, the question is, how much do you divulge? How much do you publish? Well, being naive at the time, I said, publish everything. No secrets. And that turned out to be, you know, a good strategy for academics, not a very good strategy for profits, but it turned out to be very helpful to do that, because to this day, it's a simple model. It's easy to replicate. It's easy to test. We had Professor Mazzolini today giving a paper on Italian SMEs, and of course he looked at prior models, including our model, and was able to replicate it, test it, and comment on it. So it's important to have that as a structure. Very few people who publish are usually thinking about what's going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years. The discriminant model, now standard, was at the time what we used. More recently, we use logistic models to get a probability default directly. I'm not sure it's the best methodology, but it's one that is fairly standard, and we'll point out the differences between that and a slightly different approach, which I introduced in 1989. Here is the original Z model that many of you teach in your classes or have read about, have used it in your research. Simple 5-variable model, all financial data from balance sheet income statements or the stock price for a publicly held firm, and you end up with a score. So when we published that paper, some of you may still use this concept of zones: safe zone, distress zone, and something in between called a gray zone. So what is a zone? A zone is based on some empirical data that when you built the model, at least in our case, clearly differentiated the risk of the firm defaulting, not as finely as should have been the case, but in terms of safe and distressed. Higher the score, the safer or the better in terms of its credit risk of the firm. But we knew that the reader would need some guidance, and so we established these zones based on 100% accuracy, type 1 and type 2, based on a sample of firms that went bankrupt prior to 66, sorry. I'm just getting started. Anyway, the point I want to make here is that if you are using these zones, they are outdated. You shouldn't be using them anymore, for the simple reason that there's been a migration of credit risk over these 50 years. Greater use of leverage, impact of the high-yield bond and leverage loan market, global competition for firms, more and larger bankruptcies. You know, in the United States, on average, we have $14 billion bankruptcies every year, sometimes 50 or 60 in one year. And so there is a much higher increase in the type 2 error, as we've seen in models. What do we do about it? Instead, we estimate the probability of default based on bond rating equivalence of the score and historically matching the bond rating equivalent to the actual experience of defaults in the public marketplace. So here's a list of the median Z-scores by credit rating, AA, AAA. Incidentally, guess how many AAA companies are left in the United States? Steve Figluski says 2, and as usual, he's correct. Just 2. Used to be 15, 20. How many AAA banks are left in the world? 0. And there are a few AAA countries, but AAA is essentially a dinosaur, and so we combine it with others, and you can see the average score going down. The average B-rated company today is in the distress zone from the original model. And what is the probability of default of a company who's rated B, or for banks, and they have a matching approach? Anybody get the answer? Answer, 28% over 5 years. Indeed, this was determined by a marginal and cumulative probability of default estimate using mortality rates. Just like insurance actuaries, we published this in 1989. Here's the results. And by the way, you all have access to this PowerPoint presentation. And you can see that, well, maybe you can't see it because the numbers are small. The probability of default of a single B rated company today is about 28%, and if you factor in recovery rates, loss coupons, the loss is about 20% over 5 years. So the question is now, does an expected loss of 20% of your money justify the investment in a B-rated class? The answer is very clear. Let's look at the spread, compound it, subtract out the expected loss, if you want to do a distribution around that, and you end up with a risk-return trade-off that is easy to quantify, it is acceptable to the regulators, and I think is a reasonable approach to use to get loss given default. Let me skip over some examples. And by the way, these examples are for good firms as well as firms that have failed, and talk about one example in my existence that I think was incredibly important, at least for me personally, and I hope for the United States. In 2008, you may remember we were in a really bad crisis. We didn't know whether the capitalistic system, the financial market system that we have experienced over time would survive that crisis. In retrospect, we can say we usually always survive crises. Bill Zimber in the back is an expert on crises, and he knows that they come and go. But when they come, you're never sure it will go. And that was the case in 2008. And at the time, the U.S. Congress was debating whether or not to bail out this American icon company called General Motors. And we were asked to testify before the House of Representatives as to whether or not General Motors should go bankrupt or not. Maybe it's pretty obvious now what happened, but back then, the Congress was saying, no, bankruptcy is not what we want for this huge company with so many employees, et cetera. And so we're going to vote again for a bailout by President Bush. I testified, no. Based on our analysis and based on my knowledge of the bankruptcy system in the U.S. and the use of ingenious, I think, techniques to save companies, the best thing would be for them to go bankrupt today. Look at the score. Back in 1968, you see the bottom there, the score was now below zero, deep into the D default zone. But the Congress said, no, we will not listen to you. We're going to bail out General Motors. But the Senate said, for technical reasons, let's not do it. You know, they're more conservative. And George Bush, in the last thing he did, said, we're going to bail out GM one more time, and now it's Obama's problem. Well, it was. And Obama was ingenious in his commission with forcing management to change, forcing a restructuring, and then finally, June 1st, 2009, 6 months after we predicted bankruptcy, one of the most happy days in my professional life. General Motors filed for bankruptcy. I was drunk for a week. It was just a wonderful thing to see that, and they got $50 billion in debtor in possession loans, exactly as we proposed, and look at the recovery. Today, General Motors is investment grade. We think, by the way, they deserve to be a B, not a triple B, but at least they have survived very nicely. My opinion, they would have liquidated if they continued to be bailed out the way they had been. Let me now move ahead to 5 more minutes, thank you. I can almost do that. Here are a number of the models we built over time, and I want to point out a couple of things about them. Private firm models. Yes, you can build for firms that are not publicly listed if you have a good database and you have the appropriate variables. Non-US firms, emerging market firms particularly, are relevant. Latin America, China, these are models we built in the years. Sovereign risk. Herb Reichen and I have built models for sovereign risk utilizing non-financial firm aggregation techniques and correlating it with probability of default of sovereigns. We are now working to extend that to the banking sector, combine the two, to come up with a bottom-up approach for sovereign risk assessment, compared to the traditional top-down approach that regulators and bankers to use about, debt to GDP and deficit to GDP and other macro variables. SME models. Yes, the world seems to have discovered the importance of SMEs, particularly in Europe and Southern Europe in particular, and so it's appropriate to talk about it here in Italy. Let me skip over some of the other models. I'm not going to have time to talk about current conditions, except let me just say one thing. This is the relationship between, you may have seen this before, default rates and economic recession. We all know in recessions, default rates go up. But did you know that usually default rates go up before the recession and predate, in many cases, the recession? And the next question is, where are we today? Well, if you look at the right-hand side of this graph, you'll see the default rates are all very low, slightly above average last year, mainly due to oil and gas bankruptcies. But for the most part, for 8 years now, the longest benign credit cycle since the Great Depression, we are now in my opinion, a false comfort zone in credit markets. The amount of debt that's being built up on corporate balance sheets is significant. And nobody seems to care because interest rates are low, people are reaching for yield with the high-yield bond market, leveraged loan market, and therefore, that's the only game in town to get yield. The result, more risk-taking. Regulators like Mike Gordon and his team, I'm sure, are monitoring this. But the point is, it's very difficult for regulators to do much about it as long as the risk-return trade-off appears to be good. Be careful of that going forward. Last thing I want to show you, let me ask this question. Do you think the average U.S. company today is more or less creditworthy than it was in 2007, just before the financial crisis? How many of you think that the average U.S. company today in the high-yield bond market, which is about 2,000 plus companies, are more creditworthy, more profitability, more cash, less leverage, et cetera, than it was in 2007? How many think today more creditworthy? Nobody. How many think less creditworthy? Okay, now it's an audience that I can identify with. And how many think about the same? Okay. Well, we didn't know the answer, so we did what you would expect me to do, average Z-scores in 07 versus 2016 and 15 and 14. Answer, slightly less creditworthy. The average score is about 1.7 today compared to 1.84, but not statistically different. Decision, we are no better off or worse off creditworthiness than we were in 07. Is that good news or bad news? Well, I don't think it's good news because 07 was right before the crisis. Yes, the crisis was caused by other reasons, not corporate. Last thing I want to say, and this will be quick, Menachem, I know you're getting itchy there. Here is a list, my list anyway, of applications. I'd like to talk about 3 very quickly. First, there's the obvious ones, lenders, investors, and like. There is an organization in Europe called STOXX, S-T-O-X-X. Some of you know the STOXX 600 or the STOXX 60. It's like the S&P for European stocks. No?
50.
50?
Yeah. That's
yeah. Anyway. The stocks index now, the stocks company has a basket that you can buy. It's called the Altman Z-score basket. Any firm above a certain level qualifies as a strong balance sheet. That's one application. Goldman Sachs, Nomura has similar products. A second, look at this one in the middle of the second column. purchases suppliers. Well, I learned something in a little town called A Coruña, Spain. Anybody have ever been to A Coruña? A few of you have. Yeah. It's the main city in Galicia, but it's a small city and in a somewhat depressed area in terms of economic history. There's one little company there called Inditex. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Believe it or not, it's the largest fashion retailer in the world. 23 billion turnover. A darling of the stock market. In that little city, that little company, now big company, is using Z-scores, among others, to assess the health of their suppliers. Not the accounts receivable, not lenders, but the suppliers. It's very important for a retailer, for an auto manufacturer, to have suppliers who they can depend on, who are not likely to go bankrupt. And they're not the only ones. IBM has done it and a number of other firms. Finally, although this audience is not made up of managers, entrepreneurs, and the like, we've worked with firms using the Z-score model, not as a predictor of distress, but as a guideline how to avoid distress. What do I have to do to move my score into the safer zone? And it's an interesting way of applying an academically developed model into a practitioner, firm-oriented approach. I have lots more to say, but I don't have time except to say that currently our research is emphasizing, besides the papers in this conference, this Italian mini-bond market. The thing that the Italians need, and we are in Italy, so it's appropriate to talk about, is an alternative source of financing for small and medium-sized companies. Bonds are potentially that source. If you looked at the growth rate of this market, there are now about 300 issues since late 2012, early 2013. The market is just under 10 billion euros, about 7 billion still outstanding, but there is not a credit culture yet in this market. We need a risk-return trade-off that you can measure, analyze, and then present either for firms or portfolios. And we and others are working on that, and hopefully, like the U.S. market, it will grow. Obviously, it's for smaller firms, so it's not going to grow in the same way. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience. Thank you, Menachem, for giving me an extra time. Grazie mille.
Well, you deserve an applause, though you went way over time.
I know.
And you didn't tell him one thing. After 50 years, you didn't tell him that without the zeros, we are working harder than the people outside, but...
The academics, you mean?
Yeah, the academics, but we love it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Menachem. Thank you very much.